Marcus Wellington stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city below buzz with life as the morning sun cast long shadows between the skyscrapers. At 52 years old, he had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small tech startup into a multinational corporation worth billions. His success story had been featured in countless magazines, and business students studied his strategies in universities around the world. Yet despite all his achievements and the respect he commanded in boardrooms across the globe, Marcus often felt a gnawing emptiness that no amount of money or recognition could fill. He had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier, and his 2 grown children were busy with their own lives on opposite coasts. The sprawling penthouse he called home felt more like a museum than a living space, filled with expensive art and designer furniture but lacking the warmth of genuine human connection. His daily routine had become mechanical and predictable. He would wake at 5 in the morning, work out in his private gym, shower, dress in one of his perfectly tailored suits, and head to the office before most of the city had finished their first cup of coffee. He rarely noticed the people who kept his life running smoothly, the invisible workforce that cleaned his home, prepared his meals, and ensured everything functioned seamlessly. To Marcus, they were simply part of the background, as unremarkable as the furniture or the artwork on his walls. He was not intentionally cruel or dismissive, but years of focusing solely on business had created a barrier between him and the everyday struggles of ordinary people. Alina Morales had worked as Marcus's housekeeper for nearly 2 years. She was a quiet woman in her early 40s who arrived at the penthouse each morning at 7 and left promptly at 4 in the afternoon. She moved through the vast apartment with practiced efficiency, ensuring that every surface gleamed and every item was in its proper place. Marcus had hired her through an agency and had barely spoken more than a few dozen words to her since she started. He knew almost nothing about her personal life, her dreams, or her challenges. To him, she was simply the woman who kept his home immaculate, someone whose presence he acknowledged with a brief nod when their paths crossed, but never really saw as a complete person with her own complex story. What Marcus did not know was that Alina was a single mother who had immigrated to the United States from Mexico 12 years earlier, with hopes of building a better life for her daughter. She worked 3 jobs to make ends meet, cleaning homes during the day, working as a server at a diner in the evenings, and taking overnight shifts at a warehouse on weekends. Every dollar she earned went toward rent for their small 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where sirens wailed through the night, and the smell of garbage lingered in the stairwells. Despite the exhausting schedule and the constant financial pressure, Alina never complained. She had dreams for her daughter Sophia, dreams of college and opportunities, and a life free from the crushing weight of poverty that had defined her own existence. Sophia was 15 years old, a bright and beautiful girl with her mother's dark eyes and a smile that could light up a room. She attended the local public high school where she struggled to fit in among classmates who seemed to have everything she lacked. While other students wore expensive sneakers and carried the latest smartphones, Sophia wore second-hand clothes and used a battered old phone that barely functioned. She tried to focus on her studies, knowing that education was her ticket to a better future. But the daily challenges of adolescence combined with the stress of her home situation made it increasingly difficult to maintain her optimism. She felt invisible most of the time, just another face in the crowded hallways, another girl trying to survive in a world that seemed designed to keep people like her at the bottom. On a crisp Tuesday morning in October, Marcus arrived home unexpectedly early from the office. He had left an important contract on his desk in the study and needed to retrieve it before a crucial afternoon meeting. He usually never returned home during the workday, and his sudden appearance disrupted the normal rhythm of the household. As he walked through the front door, he heard voices coming from the kitchen. Alina was speaking in rapid Spanish, her tone urgent and concerned. Marcus paused in the hallway, not intending to eavesdrop, but finding himself drawn by the unusual emotion in her voice. He had never heard her sound anything other than calm and professional during all the months she had worked for him. Curiosity overriding his usual indifference, Marcus quietly moved closer to the kitchen doorway. Through the partially open door, he could see Alina standing with her back to him, her phone pressed to her ear. Her shoulders were tense, and even without understanding Spanish, he could hear the worry in her voice. She was pleading with someone, her free hand gesturing emphatically as she spoke. Marcus felt uncomfortable intruding on what was clearly a private moment, but something kept him rooted to the spot. After a few more exchanges, Alina ended the call and stood motionless for a moment, her head bowed as if gathering strength to face whatever challenge awaited her. Marcus cleared his throat gently to announce his presence, not wanting to startle her. Alina turned quickly, her eyes widening in surprise. For a brief moment before her professional mask slipped back into place, Marcus saw something in her expression that struck him deeply. It was not just surprise at his unexpected return, but a profound sadness mixed with fear. Her eyes were red-rimmed as if she had been crying or fighting back tears. She quickly composed herself, smoothing down her apron and offering a polite greeting, but Marcus found himself actually looking at her, truly seeing her as a person for perhaps the first time since he had started working for him. Marcus Wellington stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city below buzz with life as the morning sun cast long shadows between the skyscrapers. At 52 years old, he had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small tech startup into a multinational corporation worth billions. His success story had been featured in countless magazines, and business students studied his strategies in universities around the world. Yet despite all his achievements and the respect he commanded in boardrooms across the globe, Marcus often felt a gnawing emptiness that no amount of money or recognition could fill. He had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier, and his 2 grown children were busy with their own lives on opposite coasts. The sprawling penthouse he called home felt more like a museum than a living space, filled with expensive art and designer furniture but lacking the warmth of genuine human connection. His daily routine had become mechanical and predictable. He would wake at 5 in the morning, work out in his private gym, shower, dress in one of his perfectly tailored suits, and head to the office before most of the city had finished their first cup of coffee. He rarely noticed the people who kept his life running smoothly, the invisible workforce that cleaned his home, prepared his meals, and ensured everything functioned seamlessly. To Marcus, they were simply part of the background, as unremarkable as the furniture or the artwork on his walls. He was not intentionally cruel or dismissive, but years of focusing solely on business had created a barrier between him and the everyday struggles of ordinary people. Elena Morales had worked as Marcus's housekeeper for nearly 2 years. She was a quiet woman in her early 40s who arrived at the penthouse each morning at 7 and left promptly at 4 in the afternoon. She moved through the vast apartment with practiced efficiency, ensuring that every surface gleamed and every item was in its proper place. Marcus had hired her through an agency and had barely spoken more than a few dozen words to her since she started. He knew almost nothing about her personal life, her dreams, or her challenges. To him, she was simply the woman who kept his home immaculate, someone whose presence he acknowledged with a brief nod when their paths crossed, but never really saw as a complete person with her own complex story. What Marcus did not know was that Elena was a single mother who had immigrated to the United States from Mexico 12 years earlier, with hopes of building a better life for her daughter. She worked 3 jobs to make ends meet, cleaning homes during the day, working as a server at a diner in the evenings, and taking overnight shifts at a warehouse on weekends. Every dollar she earned went toward rent for their small 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where sirens wailed through the night, and the smell of garbage lingered in the stairwells. Despite the exhausting schedule and the constant financial pressure, Elena never complained. She had dreams for her daughter Sophia, dreams of college and opportunities, and a life free from the crushing weight of poverty that had defined her own existence. Sophia was 15 years old, a bright and beautiful girl with her mother's dark eyes and a smile that could light up a room. She attended the local public high school where she struggled to fit in among classmates who seemed to have everything she lacked. While other students wore expensive sneakers and carried the latest smartphones, Sophia wore second-hand clothes and used a battered old phone that barely functioned. She tried to focus on her studies, knowing that education was her ticket to a better future. But the daily challenges of adolescence combined with the stress of her home situation made it increasingly difficult to maintain her optimism. She felt invisible most of the time, just another face in the crowded hallways, another girl trying to survive in a world that seemed designed to keep people like her at the bottom. On a crisp Tuesday morning in October, Marcus arrived home unexpectedly early from the office. He had left an important contract on his desk in the study and needed to retrieve it before a crucial afternoon meeting. He usually never returned home during the workday, and his sudden appearance disrupted the normal rhythm of the household. As he walked through the front door, he heard voices coming from the kitchen. Elena was speaking in rapid Spanish, her tone urgent and concerned. Marcus paused in the hallway, not intending to eavesdrop, but finding himself drawn by the unusual emotion in her voice. He had never heard her sound anything other than calm and professional during all the months she had worked for him. Curiosity overriding his usual indifference, Marcus quietly moved closer to the kitchen doorway. Through the partially open door, he could see Elena standing with her back to him, her phone pressed to her ear. Her shoulders were tense, and even without understanding Spanish, he could hear the worry in her voice. She was pleading with someone, her free hand gesturing emphatically as she spoke. Marcus felt uncomfortable intruding on what was clearly a private moment, but something kept him rooted to the spot. After a few more exchanges, Alina ended the call and stood motionless for a moment, her head bowed as if gathering strength to face whatever challenge awaited her. Marcus cleared his throat gently to announce his presence, not wanting to startle her. Alina turned quickly, her eyes widening in surprise. For a brief moment before her professional mask slipped back into place, Marcus saw something in her expression that struck him deeply. It was not just surprise at his unexpected return, but a profound sadness mixed with fear. Her eyes were red-rimmed as if she had been crying or fighting back tears. She quickly composed herself, smoothing down her apron and offering a polite greeting, but Marcus found himself actually looking at her, truly seeing her as a person for perhaps the first time since she had started working for him. Marcus returned to his study but could no longer focus on work. The bruise on Sophia's wrist haunted him, and his mind raced through possible explanations, each one more troubling than the last. He tried to tell himself that he might be overreacting, that there could be innocent explanations for such marks, but his instincts told him otherwise. He had not built a billion-dollar company by ignoring warning signs or dismissing his gut feelings. The way Sophia had reacted when she noticed him looking, the panic in her eyes and her immediate attempt to hide the evidence, spoke volumes about a child who was guarding a dangerous secret. Marcus found himself looking up information on his computer about signs of abuse, reading through articles written by child welfare experts and psychologists, and feeling increasingly certain that what he had witnessed was not an isolated incident. When Sophia returned from the bathroom, she kept her distance from the dining table, instead sitting on the floor near where her mother was cleaning, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. She had pulled on a cardigan over her school uniform despite the warmth of the apartment, covering her arms completely. Marcus observed from his study, noting how she seemed to make herself as small as possible, taking up minimal space as if apologizing for her very existence. Alina worked quietly, occasionally glancing at her daughter with an expression that mixed love with what appeared to be helpless worry. The dynamic between mother and daughter suggested a bond forged in adversity, two people facing the world together against overwhelming odds. Marcus wrestled with what to do with his suspicions. He barely knew these people, and it was entirely possible he was misinterpreting the situation. Perhaps Sophia had been in a fight at school or had injured herself during sports. Yet even as he tried to rationalize away his concerns, he knew he was making excuses to avoid getting involved in something complicated and potentially messy. His life had been carefully structured to avoid exactly these kinds of emotional entanglements. He wrote checks to charities and attended fundraising galas, but actual hands-on involvement with people's problems was something he had always delegated to others or avoided entirely. The easy path would be to simply ignore what he had seen and maintain the comfortable distance he had always kept from his employees' personal lives. But Marcus discovered he could not take the easy path this time. Something about Sophia reminded him too much of his own daughter at that vulnerable age. He remembered how protective he had felt when Rachel was 15, how he had worried about every boy she dated and every party she attended. He had used his wealth and influence to ensure she attended the best schools and lived in the safest neighborhoods, never having to face the kinds of dangers that clearly threatened Sophia daily. The contrast between his daughter's privileged adolescence and what he suspected Sophia was enduring created a moral imperative he found impossible to ignore. If he did nothing and something terrible happened to this girl, he would never forgive himself. When 4 o'clock arrived and Alina began gathering her cleaning supplies, Marcus emerged from his study and asked if he could speak with her privately for a moment. Alina's expression immediately became guarded, and she told Sophia to wait by the door. Marcus led Alina into his study and closed the door, trying to find the right words for an impossibly delicate conversation. He started by saying that he hoped she would not take offense at what he was about to ask, but that he had noticed something that concerned him. Alina's face paled, and her hands gripped the strap of her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. She knew exactly what he was going to say before he said it. Marcus told her gently that he had seen bruises on Sophia's wrist and that he was worried about her safety. He asked directly if someone was hurting her daughter. The question hung heavy in the air between them, and for a long moment Alina said nothing. Her eyes filled with tears that she blinked back furiously, struggling to maintain her composure. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She told him that Sophia had a boyfriend, a young man named Derek who was 18 years old and had dropped out of school the previous year. Alina had tried to forbid the relationship, but Sophia was rebellious and insisted she was in love. The situation had escalated recently, with Derek becoming increasingly possessive and controlling. Alina explained that she had only recently discovered the abuse was physical. She had noticed bruises on Sophia's arms and neck over the past month, but her daughter had insisted they were from accidents or roughhousing with friends. 2 weeks ago, Alina had come home early from her evening job to find Derek in their apartment, holding Sophia against the wall by her throat while screaming accusations that she had been talking to other boys. Alina had immediately called the police, and Derek had been arrested. However, he had been released the next day on bail, and since then he had been harassing Sophia constantly. He sent her threatening messages, showed up outside her school, and had his friends follow her around the neighborhood. Sophia was terrified but refused to testify against him because Derek had threatened to hurt her mother if she cooperated with the police. The story poured out of Alina in a rush, as if she had been holding it inside for so long that finally having someone to tell created a dam break of words and emotion. She explained that she had tried everything she could think of to protect her daughter. She had gone to the police multiple times, but they told her there was little they could do without Sophia's cooperation and without evidence of ongoing harassment. She had consulted with a legal aid lawyer, but the attorney had explained that restraining orders were difficult to enforce and often escalated dangerous situations. Alina had even considered moving to a different neighborhood, but she could not afford higher rent and was afraid that Derek would simply find them again. She felt trapped and helpless, watching her daughter sink deeper into fear and isolation while being powerless to stop it. Marcus listened with growing anger, not at Alina but at a system that seemed designed to fail vulnerable people. He thought about the resources he had at his disposal, the lawyers on retainer, the security personnel he employed, the connections throughout the city that money and influence had bought him. Here was a woman working 3 jobs to survive, facing a crisis that could destroy her daughter, and she had nowhere to turn for help. The injustice of it struck him forcefully. Through no fault of her own except being born into poverty, Alina lacked access to the tools that could protect her child. Meanwhile, he lived in luxury, insulated from such problems by wealth he had not even earned through any moral superiority, but simply through a combination of talent, timing, and luck. He told Alina that he wanted to help, that he had resources and connections that might make a difference in this situation. Alina looked at him with suspicion mixed with desperate hope. She asked why he would want to involve himself in her problems, what he expected in return. The question revealed how accustomed she was to the transactional nature of every relationship in her life, where nothing came without strings attached and generosity always carried a price tag. Marcus felt ashamed that his previous indifference to her as a person had contributed to her assumption that any offer of help must have ulterior motives. He assured her that he expected nothing in return except the chance to help keep her daughter safe. He told her that he had a daughter too, and that he could not stand by and do nothing when he had the means to potentially change the outcome of this dangerous situation. Alina broke down crying, years of accumulated stress and fear finally overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. She apologized repeatedly for losing control, but Marcus handed her tissues and told her there was no need to apologize. He asked if she would trust him to try to help, and after a long moment of hesitation, Alina nodded. She had run out of options and was willing to accept help from an unexpected source, even if she did not fully understand his motivations. Marcus told her to take the rest of the day off with pay and to bring Sophia back tomorrow so they could discuss a plan. He promised her that he would use every resource at his disposal to ensure her daughter's safety. And for the first time in weeks, Alina allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, her nightmare might finally end. Her nightmare might finally end. That evening, Marcus sat alone in his penthouse, nursing a glass of whiskey he barely tasted, while his mind worked through the complex problem Alina had laid before him. The city lights twinkled below, thousands of windows representing thousands of lives, each with their own struggles and stories he had never bothered to consider. For years, he had moved through the world focused solely on quarterly earnings, market share, and strategic acquisitions, measuring success in metrics that suddenly seemed hollow and meaningless. He had prided himself on being a problem solver, someone who could analyze difficult situations and devise elegant solutions, yet he had never applied those skills to anything that truly mattered on a human level. The realization troubled him deeply, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about the person he had become after his wife's death. Marcus pulled out his phone and called his head of corporate security, a former police detective named James Chen who had worked for his company for over a decade. James had been responsible for protecting Marcus's assets, investigating corporate espionage, and conducting background checks on potential business partners. Now Marcus was asking him to redirect those skills toward protecting a 15-year-old girl he had only met hours earlier. He explained the situation in detail, and James listened without interruption, asking clarifying questions only when necessary. When Marcus finished, James was quiet for a moment before telling him that these situations were often more dangerous than people realized. Abusive partners who felt they were losing control could escalate to lethal violence, especially when outside forces intervened. He promised to look into Derek's background and develop a comprehensive security assessment by morning. Next, Marcus called his personal attorney, Margaret Sullivan, a sharp woman in her 60s who had guided him through countless business deals and legal challenges over the years. She answered on the second ring despite the late hour, accustomed to Marcus's unpredictable schedule. He outlined Alina's situation and asked what legal options might be available to protect Sophia from her abuser. Margaret explained that the legal system moved slowly in these cases, and that restraining orders provided only limited protection. However, she suggested several strategies they could employ, including hiring a specialized attorney who focused on domestic violence cases, documenting every instance of harassment with dated photographs and written statements, and potentially pursuing criminal charges beyond the original assault. She also mentioned that Marcus needed to be careful about how involved he became, as Derek's defense attorney could potentially paint any intervention as witness tampering or wealthy interference in the justice system. Marcus spent the rest of the evening researching domestic violence statistics and reading stories from survivors. The numbers horrified him. Nearly 1 in 3 adolescent girls experienced physical, sexual, or emotional abuse from a dating partner. Every year, young women died at the hands of boyfriends and ex-boyfriends, while communities and systems failed to protect them. He read about warning signs he wished he had known to look for earlier, patterns of control and isolation that abusers employed to trap their victims. He read about the psychological manipulation that made it so difficult for victims to leave or to testify against their abusers. The fear Derek had instilled in Sophia was not irrational or weak. It was a survival response to genuine danger, and her reluctance to cooperate with authorities made tragic sense in light of the threats against her mother. Sleep eluded Marcus that night. He lay in his enormous bed, staring at the ceiling while his mind replayed images of Sophia's bruised wrist and Alina's desperate tears. He thought about his own children and how differently their lives had unfolded compared to Sophia's. His daughter Rachel had attended an elite private school where counselors and administrators watched carefully for any signs of trouble. She had grown up in a safe neighborhood where police responded immediately to any concern. She had access to therapy, legal resources, and a father with enough money and power to remove any threat to her well-being. Sophia had none of those advantages, and through no fault of her own, she was trapped in a nightmare that could easily end in tragedy. When morning finally came, Marcus was already dressed and reviewing the reports that James Chen had emailed him at 6 in the morning. Derek Morrison was 18 years old with a juvenile record that had been sealed, but that James had managed to access through his connections. The record showed a pattern of escalating violence starting at age 13, including assault charges, destruction of property, and suspected involvement in a gang. Derek's father was serving time for armed robbery, and his mother had died of a drug overdose when he was 12. He had dropped out of school at 16 and worked sporadically at manual labor jobs, though he seemed to have income that exceeded what those jobs would provide. James's assessment was blunt and concerning. Derek fit the profile of someone who could become lethal if he felt humiliated or if he lost control of his victim. The fact that Sophia had involved police and that he had been arrested represented a significant threat to his ego and his reputation. Alina arrived at 9 in the morning with Sophia, both of them looking exhausted and frightened. Marcus had asked them to come on a Saturday so they could talk without Alina having to miss work at her other jobs. He had set up the living room to feel less formal, with comfortable seating and refreshments, trying to create an environment where Sophia might feel safe enough to talk openly. When they entered, Sophia kept her eyes down, her body language radiating discomfort and shame. She wore long sleeves despite the warm day, and Marcus noticed a faint bruise on her cheekbone that she had tried to cover with makeup. The sight ignited a protective fury in him that he had to consciously suppress, knowing that displays of anger would only frighten Sophia further. Marcus started by speaking directly to Sophia, telling her that nothing that had happened to her was her fault. He explained that he wanted to help if she would let him, but that any plan would require her cooperation and honesty. Sophia looked at her mother, who nodded encouragingly, and then slowly began to tell her story. Her voice was soft and hesitant at first, but as she spoke, the words came faster, as if releasing poison she had been holding inside. She described how Derek had seemed charming and protective when they first started dating 6 months ago. He was older and seemed to offer an escape from the loneliness and invisibility she felt at school. He bought her small gifts and told her she was beautiful, making her feel special and seen for the first time in her life. But the charm had quickly transformed into control. Derek began telling her what to wear and who she could talk to. He checked her phone constantly and became enraged if she did not respond to his messages immediately. He isolated her from her few friends, convincing her that they were jealous and did not really care about her. When she tried to assert any independence, he would alternate between tearful apologies and explosive anger. The first time he hit her was 3 months into their relationship, a slap across the face when she talked to a male classmate. He had immediately broken down crying, blaming his difficult childhood and promising it would never happen again. Sophia had believed him because she desperately wanted to believe him, because admitting the truth meant acknowledging that she had made a terrible mistake. The violence had escalated from there. Derek punched walls near her head, grabbed her forcefully enough to leave bruises, and once choked her until she nearly passed out. Each incident was followed by apologies and promises to change, creating a cycle that Sophia found impossible to break. She was ashamed that she had not listened to her mother's warnings. She was terrified of what Derek might do if she tried to leave. When Alina had walked in on him attacking her and called the police, Sophia had felt both relief and terror. Derek had been released from jail the next day, and his first act was to send her a message saying that if she testified against him, her mother would pay the price. He described in graphic detail what he would do to Alina, and Sophia believed every word. She knew what Derek was capable of when angry, and she could not bear the thought of her mother suffering because of her mistakes. Marcus listened to Sophia's story with his business face on, the expression he used in difficult negotiations when he needed to hide his emotions. Inside, he was seething with rage at Derek and at a world that allowed such predators to terrorize vulnerable girls. When Sophia finished speaking, he thanked her for her courage in sharing her story and assured her that they would find a way to keep both her and her mother safe. He explained that he had resources at his disposal and that he was prepared to use all of them to end Derek's reign of terror over her life. For the first time since entering his home, Sophia looked up and met his eyes directly. In her gaze, he saw a flicker of hope mixed with skepticism. The look of someone who had been disappointed too many times to fully trust in rescue, but who desperately wanted to believe anyway. Marcus laid out a comprehensive plan that he had developed with input from James Chen and Margaret Sullivan. The first priority was ensuring Sophia's immediate physical safety, which meant she could not return to her neighborhood where Derek had easy access to her. Marcus offered to arrange for Alina and Sophia to stay in a secure apartment he owned in a different part of the city, a property he typically used for visiting executives that was currently vacant. The building had 24-hour security and required keycard access, making it much more difficult for Derek to reach them. Alina immediately protested, saying she could not accept such charity and that she needed to maintain her independence. Marcus understood her pride but gently explained that this was not about charity, but about creating the conditions necessary for Sophia's safety, while they pursued legal remedies. He continued explaining that James Chen would coordinate with the police detective handling Derek's case, providing additional documentation and evidence that might strengthen the prosecution's position. James would also arrange for discreet security personnel to monitor Sophia when she was at school or traveling to and from safe locations. Marcus emphasized that these would not be obvious bodyguards that would draw attention or make Sophia feel like a prisoner, but trained professionals who would maintain distance while ensuring Derek could not approach her. Additionally, Margaret Sullivan had connected them with Catherine Price, one of the city's most respected attorneys specializing in domestic violence and stalking cases. Catherine had agreed to represent Sophia pro bono after hearing about the situation, and she had already begun preparing a comprehensive legal strategy. Sophia looked overwhelmed by the scope of what Marcus was proposing. She asked quietly why he was doing all of this for people he barely knew, what he wanted from them in return. The question broke Marcus's heart because it revealed how transactional Sophia's world had been, how she had learned that people only helped when they expected something back. He pulled up a chair and sat down so he was at eye level with her instead of towering over her. He told her honestly that he had spent too many years focused on making money and building his company while ignoring the fact that real people with real problems existed just beyond his insulated bubble. He explained that seeing her bruises had shaken something awake in him that had been dormant since his wife died, a sense of responsibility to use his advantages to make some small difference in the world. Marcus shared that he had a daughter close to Sophia's age, and that he could not imagine the terror Alina must feel watching her child suffer while being powerless to protect her. He admitted that getting involved was partly selfish because doing nothing would haunt him for the rest of his life. He told Sophia that she deserved to feel safe, to go to school without fear, to have the chance to build a future free from violence and control. He asked nothing in return except that she trust him enough to accept help, and that she cooperate fully with the legal process regardless of Derek's threats. He promised that if Derek tried to hurt Alina, Marcus would use every resource at his disposal to protect her, including private security that would make any attack impossible. Alina was crying again, but these were different tears than the desperate ones she had shed the day before. These tears came from a place of profound relief and gratitude, from the unfamiliar experience of having someone with power and resources choose to stand beside her instead of looking through her as if she did not exist. She thanked Marcus repeatedly, struggling to find words adequate to express what his intervention meant to her family. Marcus told her that thanks were unnecessary, that he was simply doing what anyone with the means to help should do when confronted with injustice. He mentioned that he would continue to pay her regular salary even though they would not be staying at the penthouse, and that he wanted her to consider reducing her other jobs so she could focus on supporting Sophia through the difficult months ahead. Over the next several hours, they worked through the logistics of the move. James Chen arrived with a team to coordinate the security arrangements, explaining protocols and emergency procedures in calm, professional tones that helped ease Sophia's anxiety. Catherine Price joined them via video call, introducing herself to Sophia and beginning the process of building rapport with her new client. Catherine explained the legal process clearly and honestly, not sugarcoating the challenges, but also outlining the strong case they could build with proper documentation and Sophia's testimony. She addressed Sophia's fears about Derek's threats directly, explaining that witness intimidation was itself a serious crime, and that they would pursue charges for every instance of harassment and threatening behavior. Marcus arranged for a moving company to pack up Alina and Sophia's belongings from their old apartment that very afternoon. Alina protested that they had very little worth moving, and that most of their furniture was worn out anyway. Marcus insisted, understanding that maintaining continuity and familiar possessions would help Sophia feel more grounded during a chaotic transition. He also quietly arranged for the new apartment to be furnished with quality basics including new beds, a sofa, a dining table, and a television. When Alina realized what he had done, she tried again to protest the extravagance, but Marcus simply said that the apartment was furnished for executive guests and that these items were standard amenities. By early evening, Alina and Sophia were settled into their new temporary home. The apartment was on the 15th floor with large windows overlooking a tree-lined street in a quiet, affluent neighborhood. It had 2 bedrooms, a modern kitchen, and a living room that felt spacious compared to their previous cramped quarters. Sophia walked through the rooms with wonder, running her hand along the granite countertops and staring at the view as if she had been transported to another world. For the first time since Marcus had met her, he saw her smile, a genuine expression of amazement and tentative happiness that transformed her entire face. Alina stood in the middle of the living room looking dazed, as if she could not quite believe this was really happening and that at any moment someone would tell her it was all a mistake. Marcus left them to settle in, but not before ensuring they had his personal cell phone number and James Chen's contact information with instructions to call immediately if they felt unsafe or needed anything at all. As he rode the elevator down to the lobby where his driver waited, Marcus felt something he had not experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond quarterly earnings and shareholder value. He realized that in the span of 48 hours, his carefully ordered life had been disrupted by 2 people he would have overlooked completely just days earlier. The disruption felt uncomfortable and messy, involving emotional complexity and moral responsibility that could not be delegated to subordinates or resolved with a simple check. Yet despite the discomfort, Marcus felt more alive and engaged than he had since his wife's death. The numbness that had insulated him from genuine human connection was beginning to crack, letting in both pain and purpose. He thought about all the years he had spent accumulating wealth and power, always telling himself that he would eventually use it for something meaningful, but never quite getting around to defining what that meant. Now, unexpectedly, meaning had found him in the form of a frightened teenager with bruises on her wrist and a mother working 3 jobs to survive. He did not know yet if his intervention would be enough to truly change the trajectory of their lives, but he was committed to trying with everything he had. That night, Marcus did something he had not done in months. He called his daughter Rachel and really talked to her, not the surface-level conversation about school and weather that had characterized their recent interactions, but a genuine discussion about life and purpose, and using privilege responsibly. He told her about Alina and Sophia without revealing identifying details, explaining how encountering their crisis had forced him to confront his own complacency and isolation. Rachel listened with surprise and then growing enthusiasm, telling him that she was proud of him for getting involved and that Mom would have approved. The mention of his late wife brought tears to Marcus's eyes, but they were cleansing tears rather than the bitter ones he had cried in the dark months after her death. He was beginning to understand that honoring her memory meant more than preserving her foundation and attending charity galas in her name. It meant actually engaging with the world and the people in it, using his advantages to create change rather than simply writing checks from a comfortable distance. The following weeks brought both progress and challenges that tested Marcus's resolve and resources in ways he had not fully anticipated. Catherine Price moved quickly to build a comprehensive legal case against Derek Morrison, compiling evidence that included medical photographs of Sophia's injuries, screenshots of threatening text messages, and testimony from witnesses who had observed Derek's harassment outside Sophia's school. The police detective assigned to the case, a veteran named Sarah Rodriguez, initially seemed skeptical of what she probably perceived as wealthy interference in a routine domestic violence case. However, once she saw the thorough documentation and realized that Marcus's involvement meant Sophia would actually have the support necessary to follow through with prosecution, her attitude shifted to cautious cooperation. Derek responded to these developments with predictable escalation. When he discovered that Sophia and Alina had moved and that he could no longer find them at their old apartment, he began a campaign of intimidation that involved vandalizing Alina's former residence, confronting her coworkers at the diner where she still worked her evening shifts, and posting threatening messages on social media. Each incident was documented by James Chen's security team and added to the growing file that Catherine was building. Derek seemed to lack the awareness that his behavior was providing prosecutors with exactly the evidence they needed to demonstrate a pattern of stalking and witness intimidation. His rage at losing control over Sophia overrode any sense of self-preservation or strategic thinking. Marcus found himself drawn deeper into the daily realities of Alina and Sophia's lives in ways he had not initially expected. He checked in with them regularly, and what started as simple status updates evolved into genuine conversations. Alina shared stories about her journey from Mexico, the dreams that had brought her across the border and the harsh realities that had greeted her. She described working in agricultural fields under brutal conditions, living in crowded housing with dozens of other migrants, slowly saving enough money to move to the city where she hoped opportunities would be better. She talked about raising Sophia alone after the girl's father abandoned them when Sophia was just 2 years old, working multiple jobs while trying to be present for school events and parent-teacher conferences, constantly sacrificing her own needs to give her daughter chances she herself had never had. Sophia slowly began to open up as well, revealing a sharp intelligence and dry sense of humor that had been buried under layers of fear and trauma. She loved reading and writing, filling notebooks with poetry and short stories that she had never shown anyone. Marcus asked to read some of her work, and she reluctantly shared a few pieces. He was genuinely impressed by her talent, the way she captured emotion and observation in elegant, economical prose. He told her honestly that she had real ability and asked if she had ever considered pursuing writing seriously. Sophia laughed bitterly and explained that college was not realistic for someone in her situation, that she would be lucky to finish high school and find a job that paid enough to help her mother with rent. The conversation troubled Marcus deeply because it highlighted how economic circumstances created artificial ceilings on human potential. Sophia was clearly intelligent and talented, yet she had been conditioned to see her dreams as unrealistic fantasies rather than achievable goals. He began researching scholarship opportunities and educational pathways, mentioning casually to Sophia that many excellent colleges offered full financial aid to qualified students from low-income backgrounds. He could see her trying not to hope, protecting herself from disappointment, but he also noticed how she started asking tentative questions about the application process and what kinds of grades and test scores might be competitive. He arranged for her to meet with an educational consultant who worked with first-generation college students, framing it as simply getting information rather than making any commitments. Meanwhile, the legal process ground forward with frustrating slowness. Derek was arrested again after violating the restraining order that Catherine had successfully obtained, but he was released on bail within 24 hours. The judge set conditions prohibiting contact with Sophia or Alina, but everyone involved knew that such orders were merely paper barriers that determined criminals ignored. Catherine explained that building a case strong enough to result in meaningful prison time required patience and meticulous documentation. Each violation of the restraining order added charges, and the cumulative weight of evidence was making it increasingly difficult for Derek's public defender to negotiate a favorable plea deal. However, the system moved at its own pace, and trials were scheduled months in advance. The waiting was hardest on Sophia, who struggled with anxiety and nightmares despite the relative safety of her new environment. Marcus arranged for her to see a therapist who specialized in trauma and abuse, a compassionate woman named Dr. Lisa Morgan, who had worked with domestic violence survivors for over 20 years. The therapy sessions provided Sophia with tools to manage her fear and begin processing the psychological damage that Derek's abuse had inflicted. Dr. Morgan explained to Marcus that the effects of intimate partner violence went far beyond physical injuries, creating patterns of hypervigilance, damaged self-esteem, and difficulty trusting that were often harder to heal than broken bones or bruises. Marcus also insisted that Alina begin seeing Dr. Morgan, recognizing that the mother carried her own trauma from watching her daughter suffer and from years of grinding poverty and stress. Alina resisted at first, insisting that therapy was a luxury for wealthy people with time to examine their feelings, but Marcus gently persisted. He pointed out that she could not effectively support Sophia's healing if she did not address her own pain. Eventually, Alina agreed to try a few sessions. She later admitted to Marcus that being able to talk to someone who listened without judgment and who validated her experiences had been profoundly healing. She had spent so many years simply surviving that she had never stopped to acknowledge the toll that survival had taken on her emotional well-being. As November turned to December, Marcus found that his involvement with Alina and Sophia's situation had fundamentally altered his daily existence. He still ran his company and attended meetings and made business decisions, but these activities no longer consumed his entire focus. He thought about the two women living in his property, checking in with James about their security and with Catherine about legal developments multiple times each day. His executive team noticed the change in him, commenting privately among themselves about how their normally distant CEO seemed more present and engaged, asking about their families and actually listening to the answers rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. Marcus's son David called one evening, having spoken with Rachel about their father's unexpected involvement in his housekeeper's life. David was more skeptical than his sister, questioning whether Marcus was developing an inappropriate attachment to Alina or whether there were aspects of the situation that Marcus was not seeing clearly. The questions stung because they implied motivations Marcus did not have, but he recognized that from outside his perspective, the situation might appear questionable. A wealthy widower suddenly intensely involved in the life of his attractive younger housekeeper could certainly be misinterpreted. Marcus explained patiently to his son that his interest was purely about helping people in need, and that any suggestion of romantic involvement was completely off base. David seemed only partially convinced, but said he trusted his father's judgment and simply wanted to make sure Marcus was being careful. The conversation with David made Marcus more conscious of how his involvement might be perceived by others. He discussed it with Margaret Sullivan, who advised him to maintain appropriate boundaries and to ensure that all financial arrangements were properly documented and transparent. She suggested creating a formal charitable structure if he intended to continue supporting Elena and Sophia beyond the immediate crisis, something that would stand up to scrutiny if anyone questioned his motivations. Marcus recognized the wisdom in this advice and instructed Margaret to establish a foundation focused on supporting domestic violence survivors and their families. Elena and Sophia would be the first beneficiaries, but the structure would allow him to help others in similar situations in a way that was clearly philanthropic rather than personal. On a cold evening in mid-December, Catherine Price called with significant news. Derek Morrison had been arrested again, this time for assault charges unrelated to Sophia. He had gotten into a fight at a bar and seriously injured another young man, putting him in the hospital with a fractured skull. Derek was being held without bail because the new charges combined with his existing violations made him a clear danger to the community. More importantly, the victim's family had hired a private attorney who was pursuing both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit, which meant Derek would face consequences from multiple directions simultaneously. Catherine explained that while she took no pleasure in another person being hurt, Derek's own behavior had finally created the circumstances necessary to keep him confined while they built their case. The news meant that Sophia could finally breathe without constantly looking over her shoulder. When Marcus shared the update with her and Alina, the relief in the apartment was palpable. Sophia actually cried, great heaving sobs that seemed to release months of accumulated terror and stress. Alina held her daughter while her own tears fell, and Marcus found himself unexpectedly emotional as well. He had not realized how heavily the weight of their fear had been pressing on him until it lifted. That evening, for the first time since they had met, the three of them shared a meal together, not as employer and employees or benefactor and recipients, but as people who had been through something difficult together and emerged on the other side forever changed by the experience. Christmas approached, and Marcus found himself experiencing the holiday season with genuine feeling for the first time since his wife's death. In previous years, he had gone through the motions mechanically, attending obligatory corporate parties and exchanging expensive but impersonal gifts with business associates. The penthouse had remained undecorated because the thought of celebrating without his wife felt hollow and painful. This year felt different, infused with a sense of purpose and connection that had been absent from his life for so long. He found himself thinking about how to make the holiday special for Sophia and Alina, wanting to give them not just material gifts, but experiences that might create positive memories after months of fear and struggle. Marcus invited Alina and Sophia to help him decorate his penthouse, an activity he had avoided for 3 years. They spent an afternoon transforming the sleek, minimalist space into something warmer and more festive. Sophia revealed an artistic eye as she arranged ornaments on the tree, creating patterns of color and light that were genuinely beautiful. Alina shared traditions from her childhood in Mexico, describing the posadas celebrations and the foods her mother used to prepare. As they worked together, Marcus found himself sharing memories of Christmases with his late wife, stories he had not spoken aloud in years. Talking about her no longer felt like touching an open wound, but rather like honoring someone he had loved deeply and would always carry with him. Sophia's transformation over the past weeks had been remarkable. With consistent therapy, the security of stable housing, and freedom from Derek's constant threats, she was beginning to reclaim aspects of herself that had been buried under trauma. Her natural intelligence and curiosity emerged more each day. She asked Marcus questions about his business and seemed genuinely interested in understanding how companies operated and grew. He found himself explaining concepts of entrepreneurship and strategic thinking, and was impressed by how quickly she grasped complex ideas. She reminded him of himself at that age, hungry for knowledge and opportunity, but lacking access to the networks and resources that privilege provided. Marcus arranged for Sophia to take the SAT prep course and covered the costs of college application fees. He was careful to frame this as an investment rather than charity, explaining that talent was universal but opportunity was not, and that helping capable young people reach their potential benefited everyone. Sophia threw herself into test preparation with intense focus, as if determined to prove worthy of the chances being offered to her. Her school counselor reported to Alina that Sophia's grades had improved dramatically since the beginning of the school year, and that several teachers had commented on how much more engaged and confident she seemed in class. Alina had also flourished in the stability of their new circumstances. With Marcus's encouragement, she had quit her overnight warehouse job and reduced her hours at the diner, giving her more time to rest and to be present for Sophia. The chronic exhaustion that had marked her features began to fade, replaced by a vitality that made her look years younger. She took pride in maintaining the apartment Marcus had provided, but she also began pursuing interests she had long abandoned. She enrolled in English classes at the community center, determined to improve her language skills. She talked about eventually getting her GAD and perhaps training for a career in healthcare, dreams she had set aside as impossible luxuries, but was now beginning to see as achievable goals. The legal proceedings against Derek continued to advance. Catherine Price had successfully argued for the consolidation of all charges against him, including the original assault on Sophia, multiple violations of the restraining order, witness intimidation, and the new assault charge from the bar fight. Derek's public defender was pushing for a plea agreement, recognizing that taking the combined charges to trial would almost certainly result in a lengthy prison sentence. Catherine kept Sophia informed of every development, preparing her for the possibility that she might need to testify, but also explaining that Derek's own behavior had created such overwhelming evidence that a plea deal was increasingly likely. In mid-December, Derek's attorney proposed a plea agreement that would involve him serving 4 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation, with strict conditions prohibiting any contact with Sophia or her family. Catherine presented the offer to Sophia, explaining that accepting it would mean avoiding the trauma of a trial, but would also result in a shorter sentence than they might achieve through conviction on all charges. Sophia struggled with the decision, torn between wanting Derek held fully accountable and wanting to avoid having to face him in court and recount the details of his abuse in front of strangers. Marcus and Alina both made clear that the choice was entirely hers, that they would support whatever decision she made. After several days of consideration and long discussions with Dr. Morgan, Sophia decided to accept the plea agreement. She explained that 4 years felt like an eternity at her age, long enough for her to finish high school and college and build a life completely separate from Derek. She acknowledged that part of her wanted him to face the maximum possible consequences, but she also recognized that trials were uncertain and that testifying would require her to relive trauma she was working hard to heal from. Catherine ensured that the plea agreement included provisions requiring Derek to complete anger management and domestic violence intervention programs, and prohibiting him from any direct or indirect contact with Sophia or Alina for the duration of his sentence and probation. The day Derek formally entered his plea was emotionally complex for everyone involved. Sophia insisted on being present in the courtroom, wanting to face him one final time from a position of strength rather than fear. Marcus accompanied her and Alina, sitting quietly in the gallery while Catherine stood beside Sophia at the prosecutor's table. When Derek was led into the courtroom in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit, Sophia stiffened but did not look away. Derek tried to catch her eye, but Sophia kept her gaze steady and neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing fear or anger or any emotion at all. When the judge asked if he understood the terms of the plea agreement and the rights he was waiving, Derek's voice was barely audible as he confirmed his acceptance. The judge then did something unexpected. She addressed Sophia directly, telling her that she admired her courage in coming forward and staying strong through a difficult process. She told Sophia that what Derek had done to her was criminal and wrong, that she bore no responsibility for his choices, and that the court took domestic violence seriously. She encouraged Sophia to continue with counseling and to pursue her education and dreams without letting this experience define her entire life. The judge's words, spoken with genuine warmth and concern, moved everyone in the courtroom. Sophia nodded, tears streaming down her face. But when she left the courthouse, she walked with her head held high, no longer looking over her shoulder or flinching at sudden movements. The relief and closure that the plea agreement provided allowed Sophia and Alina to finally begin thinking about their future in concrete terms, rather than simply surviving day to day. Marcus had been thinking about their long-term situation as well, recognizing that his temporary solutions needed to evolve into something more sustainable. He sat down with Alina for a serious conversation about what came next, emphasizing that he wanted to help them build genuine independence rather than creating permanent dependence on his support. He offered Alina a full-time position managing his household at a salary that would allow her to support herself and Sophia comfortably while working reasonable hours. The position would include health insurance and other benefits, as well as flexibility to accommodate Sophia's school schedule and Alina's own educational pursuits. Alina was overwhelmed by the offer, hardly able to believe that the job she had been doing for poverty wages had evolved into a career opportunity that would provide stability and dignity. She accepted with gratitude but also with pride, emphasizing that she would earn every dollar through excellent work and dedication. Marcus assured her that he had no doubt of that, and that he considered himself fortunate to have someone so trustworthy and capable managing his home. He also told her that the apartment she and Sophia currently occupied was hers to stay in for as long as she wanted it, at a rent adjusted to be affordable on her new salary. He had decided to remove it from his portfolio of executive housing, and instead use it as part of his expanding foundation's work supporting domestic violence survivors in their transition to safety and independence. As Christmas Eve arrived, Marcus hosted a small dinner at his penthouse for a carefully chosen group. His children Rachel and David flew in, curious to meet the people who had so profoundly affected their father's life in recent months. James Chen and his wife joined them, as did Catherine Price and Dr. Morgan, the team who had worked together to keep Sophia safe and help her heal. Alina cooked traditional Mexican dishes that filled the penthouse with incredible aromas, and Sophia helped serve the meal with grace and confidence that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The conversation around the table was warm and genuine, people from vastly different worlds finding common ground in their shared investment in Sophia's well-being and future. During dinner, Marcus stood to offer a toast. He spoke about how encountering Alina and Sophia had changed his life in ways he was still processing, how their courage in facing impossible circumstances had reminded him what true strength looked like. He thanked everyone at the table for their various contributions to helping two people who deserved every chance to build better lives. He raised his glass to second chances, to using privilege responsibly, and to the possibility of meaningful connection across boundaries of class and circumstance that too often kept people isolated in separate worlds. As everyone clinked glasses, Marcus caught Alina's eye across the table and saw in her expression a mixture of gratitude, dignity, and cautious hope for whatever future they were all building together. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the kitchen was cleaned, Sophia asked Marcus why he had really done all of this. She understood his explanations about wanting to help and having resources to share, but she sensed there was something deeper motivating his extraordinary intervention in their lives. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering how to articulate feelings he had barely examined himself. Finally, he told her that when his wife died, he had closed himself off from genuine human connection because it hurt too much to care deeply and risk loss. He had retreated into the cold comfort of business and wealth, where success could be measured in numbers and emotions could be kept at arm's length. Seeing her bruises and her mother's desperation had cracked open that protective shell, forcing him to feel again and to recognize that a life lived entirely for oneself was ultimately empty regardless of how many zeros appeared in a bank account. 6 months after Derek Morrison entered his plea and began serving his sentence, Marcus stood in the audience of Sophia's high school auditorium, watching her accept an award for outstanding achievement in English literature. She walked across the stage with confidence, her posture straight and her smile genuine, looking nothing like the frightened girl who had tried to hide bruises in his dining room less than a year earlier. The principal announced that Sophia had been accepted to several prestigious universities with full scholarship packages, and the applause that filled the auditorium came not just from proud family members, but from teachers and classmates who had witnessed her remarkable transformation. Marcus found himself clapping until his hands hurt, feeling a surge of pride that rivaled anything he had experienced at corporate victories or business milestones. Alina sat beside him, tears of joy streaming down her face as she watched her daughter receive recognition that once seemed impossibly out of reach. She had completed her GED 3 months earlier and had enrolled in a nursing assistant training program at the community college, pursuing the healthcare career she had dreamed about for years. The chronic worry and exhaustion that had aged her prematurely was gone, replaced by a vitality and hope that made her seem like a different person. She had saved enough money from her salary to begin thinking about eventually moving into her own place, though Marcus had assured her there was no rush and that the apartment was hers for as long as she wanted it. Alina was determined to achieve full independence, not because she was ungrateful for Marcus's help, but because reclaiming agency over her own life was essential to her healing and self-respect. The foundation Marcus had established to support domestic violence survivors had grown beyond anything he initially envisioned. What started as a legal structure to formalize his support for Alina and Sophia had evolved into a comprehensive program providing housing assistance, legal advocacy, counseling services, and educational support to dozens of families escaping abusive situations. Marcus had recruited a professional staff to run the foundation's daily operations, but he remained actively involved, meeting regularly with families and hearing their stories. Each person he helped represented not just a charitable act, but a genuine human connection that enriched his own life in ways he was still discovering. The work had given him a sense of purpose that business success had never provided, a feeling that his wealth and advantages were finally being used for something that truly mattered. Catherine Price had become the foundation's chief legal advocate, leaving her private practice to dedicate herself full-time to representing survivors who could never have afforded her services otherwise. She told Marcus that working with Alina and Sophia had reminded her why she became a lawyer in the first place, and that she could no longer return to a practice where her time was billed in 6-minute increments to wealthy corporate clients. Together, they had successfully advocated for policy changes in how local law enforcement responded to domestic violence calls, implementing protocols that took victim safety more seriously and held abusers accountable more consistently. The work was challenging and often heartbreaking, but it was also profoundly meaningful in ways that made all the difficulties worthwhile. Dr. Morgan had also joined the foundation as its clinical director, overseeing a team of therapists who provided trauma-informed counseling to survivors and their children. She had developed specialized programs addressing the unique needs of adolescent victims like Sophia, recognizing that teen dating violence required different interventions than adult domestic violence. The waiting list for services was long, a painful reminder of how many people were suffering in situations similar to what Sophia had endured, but the foundation was expanding steadily and helping more families each month. Dr. Morgan told Marcus that his willingness to see Sophia as a complete person, rather than just another statistic, had saved not just one girl, but had created ripples that would ultimately touch thousands of lives. James Chen continued to oversee security operations for Marcus's business interests, but he had also trained a team specifically focused on protecting survivors who faced ongoing threats from their abusers. His background in law enforcement gave him insights into how perpetrators thought and operated, allowing him to anticipate dangers and implement protections that kept vulnerable people safe during the critical period when they were most at risk. He had developed relationships with police departments across the region, creating communication channels that ensured threats were taken seriously and responded to quickly. James rarely showed emotion, but Marcus knew that the work with domestic violence survivors had become personally important to him in ways he did not often articulate. Sophia had decided to attend a university several hours away from the city, far enough to feel like a fresh start, but close enough that she could visit her mother regularly. She would study creative writing and psychology, wanting to eventually work with young people facing challenges similar to those she had overcome. She talked about writing a book someday, a memoir that might help other girls recognize the warning signs of abusive relationships and find the courage to seek help before situations became dangerous. Marcus had no doubt she would accomplish everything she set her mind to, and he had promised to stay connected as a mentor and friend regardless of distance or time. The relationship between Marcus, Alina, and Sophia had evolved into something that defied easy categorization. They were not quite family, but were far more than employer and employees or benefactor and recipients. They were people whose lives had intersected at a critical moment and who had been fundamentally changed by that intersection. Marcus consulted Alina about major foundation decisions, valuing her perspective as someone who had lived the experiences they were trying to address. Sophia called him for advice about college choices and career planning, trusting his judgment, but also challenging his assumptions when she disagreed. The dynamic was messy and complicated, and sometimes uncomfortable, crossing boundaries that society tried to maintain between different classes and backgrounds. But it was also authentic and meaningful in ways that Marcus's carefully controlled previous life had never been. His children, Rachel and David, had initially been skeptical of their father's dramatic transformation, worried that he was having some kind of midlife crisis or being taken advantage of by people who recognized his vulnerability as a lonely widower. However, as they spent time with Alina and Sophia and witnessed the Foundation's work, their skepticism transformed into respect and even admiration. Rachel had volunteered with the Foundation during her summer break, working directly with survivors and discovering a passion for social justice that influenced her decision to pursue a law degree with plans to specialize in family law. David remained more reserved, but he had quietly made a substantial donation to the Foundation and had begun asking his own employees about their personal lives and challenges rather than maintaining the distant professionalism he had learned from his father's earlier example. On the evening after Sophia's award ceremony, Marcus hosted a small celebration dinner at his penthouse. Alina had cooked Sophia's favorite foods, and the table was decorated with flowers and candles that created a warm, festive atmosphere. As they ate and talked and laughed together, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since the morning he had unexpectedly come home and overheard Alina's worried phone conversation. That moment of curiosity, that choice to actually see the people who existed at the margins of his privileged life, had set in motion a chain of events that transformed not just Alina and Sophia's circumstances, but his own understanding of what made life meaningful. Sophia gave a short speech thanking everyone who had helped her reach this milestone, her voice strong and clear without any of the hesitation or fear that once characterized her words. She acknowledged that she had made mistakes in her relationship with Derek, that she had ignored warning signs and rationalized behavior that should have alarmed her. She talked about the shame she carried for allowing herself to be victimized and how long it took her to understand that Derek's choices were not her responsibility. She thanked her mother for never giving up on her even when Sophia pushed her away, and she thanked Marcus for seeing her as someone worth saving when she had nearly given up on herself. By the time she finished speaking, everyone at the table was crying, moved by her honesty and courage and the remarkable journey she had traveled in such a short time. Marcus spoke last, telling Sophia and Alina that they had given him far more than he had given them. They had reminded him that wealth and success meant nothing if they existed only for self-gratification, that privilege carried responsibility to use advantages in service of something larger than personal comfort. They had dragged him out of the emotional isolation he had retreated into after his wife's death, forcing him to feel and care and engage with the messy reality of other people's lives. He told them that his wife would have loved them both and would have been proud of the work they had inspired. He raised his glass in a toast to new beginnings, to the strength found in vulnerability, to the possibility of change even when circumstances seemed hopeless, and to the profound truth that we are all connected in ways we often fail to recognize until crisis forces us to truly see each other. As the evening wound down and Sophia helped her mother clean up the kitchen despite Marcus's protests that they were guests, he stood again at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The view was the same as it had been a year earlier, the same buildings and streets and lights stretching to the horizon, but everything felt different now. Each window represented lives being lived, struggles being endured, dreams being pursued or abandoned based on circumstances often beyond individual control. Marcus no longer saw an abstract cityscape but a collection of human stories, some triumphant and others tragic, all deserving of recognition and dignity. He could not help everyone, could not solve every problem or prevent every injustice, but he could use his resources and advantages to make a tangible difference for some people and perhaps inspire others with similar privileges to do the same. His phone buzzed with a text from James Chen alerting him to a new case that had come to the Foundation's attention. A woman with 3 young children fleeing an abusive partner and desperately needing safe housing. Marcus read the details and immediately replied that they should provide emergency assistance, knowing that each new case represented another opportunity to transform crisis into hope. The work would never be finished, the need would always exceed available resources, but that was not a reason to do nothing. It was a reason to do everything possible with what he had, to build systems and networks and partnerships that could address problems at scale while never losing sight of the individual human beings at the center of each story. Marcus turned from the window to see Sophia and Alina laughing together in the kitchen, their bond stronger for everything they had survived together. In that moment, he understood with perfect clarity that the bruises he had spotted on Sophia's wrist that afternoon were not just evidence of one girl's suffering, but an invitation to become the person his late wife had always believed he could be. By choosing to truly see those bruises and to care about what they represented, by refusing to look away from pain that existed outside his comfortable bubble, he had discovered that the heart he thought had broken beyond repair was actually capable of expanding to hold more love and purpose than he had imagined possible. The journey that began with a glimpse of hidden pain had led him home to himself, and for that gift he would be grateful for the rest of his life. He would be grateful for the rest of his life.